Good morning. Today we will speak about Mary Shelley. She was born on the 30th of August, 1797, and she died on the 1st of February, 1851. Both her father and her mother were great and renowned intellectuals in England. Her father's name was William Godwin, so her name was Mary Godwin, even if we know her as Mary Shelley because of her husband's name, Percy B. Shelley. His father was a philosopher. He specialized in political philosophy, especially in some kind of anarchism, claiming that there was no need for any institution for the human person to lead a healthy and sustainable life. Mary Wollstonecraft was also an intellectual, and she was a feminist, way too advanced for her time, and maybe even too advanced for our time. Just remember, please mark this fact. Mary Wollstonecraft, Mary Shelley's mom, signed her works. Mary Shelley, her daughter, meaning at least a few decades after her, didn't sign her works because it was not well seen for a woman to write. So the fact that Mary Wollstonecraft signed her own works speaks eloquently about how advanced she was for her time without naming the ideas that she was writing. She came to her marriage with a daughter from a previous relationship whose name was Fanny. And the daughter of William Godwin and Mary Wollstonecraft would be Mary Godwin, whom we will know as Mary Shelley. For now, since there are so many Marys in this life, in this biography, I'm going to name Mary Shelley, Mary Shelley, knowing that that was the name she would take eventually, only after she married Percy B. Shelley. Only 11 days after Mary Shelley's birth, her mother, Mary Wollstonecraft, died from the childbirth complications. Soon after that, Godwin remarried. He married Mary Jane Claremont, who came to the marriage with Jane, who was also called Clara, with a younger child whose name was Charles, and one who was coming on the way. Mary Shelley depicts Mary Jane Claremont as an evil stepmother. Was she really that bad? I don't think so. I think she was trying her best. Nevertheless, from Mary Shelley's perspective, she was an overbearing, evil stepmother, and that's the way she represents her. I feel sorry for Mary Jane Claremont because she was always overshadowed by William Godwin's previous spouse. Actually, the portrait of Mary Wollstonecraft was there standing in the living room, always overshadowing her. And since she was no intellectual, she always felt belittled under the shadow of Mary Wollstonecraft. In the intellectual conversations that William Godwin hosted, there came a young man whose name was Percy B. Shelley. He and Mary Shelley had a very good rapport. Mary Shelley describes their attraction as intellectual, so they delved into their intellectual conversations, speaking about aesthetics, speaking about politics, speaking about philosophy, speaking about literature. And Mary Shelley idealized her mother, Mary Wollstonecraft. She never got to meet her. She didn't know her own mother, but she knew her through her works. And she read her mother's works, sometimes at the graveyard, before the tomb of her mother. And she started reading those works together with Percy B. Shelley. Some of the romantic legends or biographies make this intellectual relationship eventually turn not so intellectual. And the fact is that Percy B. Shelley and Mary Shelley would elope. They would escape. They would escape. And of course, this is a romantic ideal, right? Well, no. Because they didn't escape alone. They took along Mary Shelley's half-sister, Jane. By the way, Percy B. Shelley was already married. His wife's name was Harriet, and they had 2 children. But that didn't prevent Percy B. Shelley from escaping with Mary Shelley, and they went through France. And this was around the year 1815. What was happening in France at that time? It was just the end of the Napoleonic Wars. So they came to France, and they saw it was completely destroyed because of the havoc that the Napoleonic Wars had left behind. In 1815, she gave birth to a child whose name was William. Why did Mary Shelley call her child William? Well, her father, William, had disowned her. He had never approved of her relationship with Percy B. Shelley, much less approved of her elopement. And in an attempt to gain back her father's grace, she named her own son William. Don't get too attached to him, he will die soon. And also remember that in the novel Frankenstein, there's a child whose name is William, who also dies. 1816 is known as the year without a summer because of the eruptions of Mount Tambora in Indonesia. It's nothing close to what happened with the dinosaurs, but well, the point is there was no summer that year. Okay, so it was very dark, and they were in Switzerland, in Geneva, and the weather is poor. So imagine now the weather without a summer. That had Mary Shelley, Jane, and Percy B. Shelley confined in Lord Byron's villa, along with Lord Byron's doctor, Polidori. So we have at least 5 persons in the same villa, and things were getting a little too heated for the atmosphere. So Lord Byron came up with the idea of having them writing a Gothic tale. By the way, Gothic stories were already circulating. It's not something new. Nevertheless, you can say that Mary Shelley's Frankenstein is the peak. It's the climax of this Gothic style. It was in this moment when Mary Shelley started writing Frankenstein. Lord Byron's doctor, Polidori, came up with The Vampire, another Gothic tale that was a tale that represented Lord Byron himself. So the vampire is Lord Byron, who sucks blood, especially from women. And Jane, Mary's half-sister, was pursuing Lord Byron. Eventually, they would also parent a daughter, whose name would be Allegra. This would happen in the year 1817, when Allegra was born. Again, don't get too attached to her. She would die in 1823, aged 5 years. And it was a very sad story, both for Mary and for her half-sister Jane, because Lord Byron had the custody removed from Jane. So Lord Byron had the daughter, the baby girl, given to some other parents who could not take her, well, at least could not prevent her from dying when she was 5. 1816. The year without a summer, when Lord Byron had his friends writing these Gothic stories, was also the year that saw 2 important suicides. The first suicide we are referring to is the suicide of Mary Shelley's older sister, Fanny, half-sister, but she loved her as a sister, and Mary Shelley felt guilty because she committed suicide. The other important suicide is that of Percy Shelley's wife, Harriet. As I mentioned, she had 2 children from Percy Shelley, and she was pregnant when she committed suicide. 1 month after she committed suicide, Mary Shelley and Percy Shelley got married. At least they left 1 month, right, for the mourning of Harriet. No, actually no. It was 1 month because it took them 1 month to retrieve the body of Harriet, who had drowned herself in the river. So as soon as they found the body, they could get married. And of course, they got married out of love, right? No. It was only because that would improve Percy Shelley's chances to gain the custody of the children. That was the reason why they got married. So don't think this was an exemplary marriage or love-filled marriage. It's also in this time when Mary Shelley wrote her biography that has been published as a novel, Matilda. In the year 1818, she had her great novel, Frankenstein, published. Remember, she had started writing it previously, and what started like a short story eventually expanded, and we ended up with the novel, Frankenstein. That same year, William, her firstborn, well, actually, he's not the firstborn, but the first child who had survived at least a few years, he died. He died of malaria. Before William, she had had another daughter. I think she remained unnamed, and she died when she was only 2 months old. And Mary Shelley woke up in the night. She thought she was asleep, so she left her sleep, and the next morning, the baby girl was dead. This haunted Mary Shelley with visions, and you can start seeing some of the inspiration for Frankenstein trying to bring her baby girl back to life. And the haunting visions and nightmares that chased her. In the year 1822, Mary had her 5th and last pregnancy, which was a very difficult pregnancy. She miscarried and she almost died of blood loss. That same year, Percy Shelley died, quote unquote. It was ruled as an accident because there was a stormy weather, and he embarked, nevertheless, near La Spezia in the northern Gulf of, in the northern Adriatic Sea, northern Italy. He embarked, but I see this, and many people see it too, as a suicide. It was clear that whoever embarked with those conditions of weather would die. And eventually, of course, he died. And so this leaves us with Mary Shelley, who's aged 26, who's a widow. We're speaking about the year 1823. Again, Mary Shelley is 26. She's a widow. She's maybe the last great romantic still alive. So she's famous, and she's regarded as a living relic. She tried to get help when she went back to England from Lord Byron, who didn't help her, and from her own father. And let me read you a quote from a letter that William wrote to his daughter, Mary Shelley. So, Mary Shelley didn't receive any help from Lord Byron. Mary Shelley didn't receive any help from her father. Her father wrote, "Frankenstein is the most wonderful work to have been written at 20 years of age that I have ever heard of. You are now 25, and most fortunately, you have pursued a course of reading and cultivated your mind in a manner the most admirably adapted to make you a great and successful author. If you cannot be independent, who should be?" So it's a praise, and at the same time, it's a dismissal. He would not help her. Mary dedicated the rest of her life to editing her husband's works and having them published. She also helped a little with the editing and the publishing of Lord Byron's works. She received several marriage proposals, but she declined all of them, and that's why we know her as Mary Shelley, because she kept forever her husband's last name. And she died aged, I think, 51 from a brain tumor. She also dedicated the rest of her life to helping women that had fallen into a dishonor, into a state of dishonor. So she rehabilitated women who were outcasts of society. Let us focus now on the modern Prometheus or Frankenstein. Remember that these two titles come together in the novel and they cannot be disassociated. What are the sources of inspiration for this great work? That's the first question. And the second point I want to delve into is, what does it mean? What are the interpretations, and how can we look, from what angle should we look, from what angle should we approach this great work? Let me focus on three major sources. One of them, we get it from the very title itself, Modern Prometheus. So it calls our attention toward the Greek myth of Prometheus. I'll come back there. The second one is Milton's Satan, because she had recently read Paradise Lost and she had been powerfully impressed. And the final tale is the tale of Narcissus. I'm going to elaborate a little more on this. When we hear of the titan Prometheus, what do we think of? There are two main myths, okay? One of them, we get it from Aeschylus, which is chained Prometheus. And why is Prometheus chained? Because he stole the fire from the gods. Even in Aeschylus' narrative, we find an elaboration of all the benefits that Prometheus had bequeathed to mankind. It's not only fire, but it's also arts, it's also the taming of beasts, it's also the arts of navigation, it's also the arts of grammar. So overall, it's science, it's power, it's knowledge. Maybe the fire is a symbol of that knowledge that Prometheus had given to men. On the other hand, fire can be assumed not as a metaphor, but literally, fire. And you see that fire, through the conduit of electricity, is also a major element in the novel. It's a major symbol. So, is this modern Prometheus someone who has stolen knowledge from the gods? Or is this modern Prometheus a Prometheus who has stolen that divine fire, that divine spark that can lit life? That's the first question, right? Modern Prometheus. There's another myth. We get it from Ovid's Metamorphoses. And here we have Prometheus not only giving fire to men, but also creating men. So this speaks to us also in a very eloquent way about that creation. So who's the modern Prometheus? Is it Victor Frankenstein who creates a new sort of man? Or is it Victor Frankenstein who attains that divine fire, or who elevates himself to that divine knowledge? So I don't think one interpretation should exclude the others. And maybe Mary Shelley had all these interpretations in her mind when she was writing the novel. The other major source is Milton's Satan. And of course, we find that force of rhetoric in Milton's Satan that is transposed to the monster, to the creature. Maybe when you read it in a translation, you lose this. Even when you read it in English, if you don't pay enough attention, but the speech of the monster has a more ancient English than the rest of the novel. Did you notice that?
Yes.
Why? Because he's speaking like Milton's Satan. So this is a novel written in the early 1800s. Milton's Satan was written in the mid 1600s. So we are speaking with a little more archaic English. And that's a difference that Mary Shelley brings in. The monster is a representation or is created after the template that Milton had given through his Satan. First, because he's very eloquent, but maybe even more important, because he rebels against his creator. Both in the myth of Prometheus and in Milton's Satan, we find that act of rebellion against one's creator, right? We find that act of rebellion against one's creator, and those are themes that can be dealt upon as we read the novel. On the other hand, we have the myth of Narcissus. According to Ovid, Narcissus was in love with himself, and there was a pond that had not ever been touched. So the surface was completely clear. Not even leaves fell on the pond. So it was the most perfect mirror-like pond ever. When Narcissus saw his own image, being in love with himself, he drowned. You know this myth, right? What does it have to do with Mary Shelley's Frankenstein? The monster looks at his reflection on a pond. And unlike Narcissus, who was beautiful, and realizes how beautiful he is, the monster realizes how hideous he is. It's like the inversion of the myth of Narcissus. Here there's also a lot of philosophy involved. John Locke, the author of An Essay on Human Understanding. He's not the first one to say this, but he says it very eloquently, and maybe this was the primary source for Mary Shelley's understanding of human knowledge. An Essay on Human Understanding. Our intellects are blank, and through experience, especially through sensorial experience, we gain knowledge little by little. I think that's clear, right? In our own lives, in our own experience, and in the novel. Because at first, the monster is unaware. Then, little by little, he starts gaining experience of different things. He starts gaining experience of various things, one of which is important, fire. He looks at fire and he says, whoa, this is amazing. Then he touches it and it burns. So he feels that pain and he grunts. So he is coming to the realization of the exterior world through his senses. This gives us an idea of Mary Shelley's understanding of human knowledge. However, unlike John Locke, let's go back to Platonic ideals. We don't need experience to gain knowledge of what is beautiful. We have that innate idea of what is beautiful. So the monster doesn't even have to compare himself with other things to realize that he is ugly. Because the idea of beauty is innate in him, and just by looking at himself, he realizes how ugly he is. Narcissus is in love with himself and with his beauty, and that brings ruin to him. The monster, in a certain sense, you can say, he falls in love with his ugliness. Think of St. Augustine's saying, amor meus, pondus meu, eo feror quocunque feror. My love is my pondus, is my weight, it's the force that propels me. It is Narcissus' love for himself, his narcissism, that makes him drown himself. With the monster, we find also that narcissism. He's in love with his ugliness, and it is that love for his own hideousness that catapults him to all of his actions. He's moved by those actions, by that sense of self, by what he has encountered within himself. So, leaving now behind the sources for this novel, let's start trying to elucidate what this novel could mean and what's the significance of this novel. A first approach is to just read it at face value and see what Mary Shelley is trying to say to us. So, literature is not a riddle. Let us just follow the narrative line that Mary Shelley gives us and understand what she means. So, what does she say about her own work? Or how can we understand the interpretation of the work from the work itself? For example, in page 9, I think it's the critical edition. To speak to the mysterious fears of our nature and awaken thrilling horror, one, to make the reader dread to look around. If it did not, frightful would be the effect of any human endeavor to mock the stupendous mechanisms of the Creator. Maybe Mary Shelley is delving into the horrors of scientific experimentation. In those times, it was illegal to experiment on human corpses, except they were the corpses of criminals. And there were not enough for the research. So, some people dedicated themselves to grave robbery. And robbing graves, excavating corpses from the graves, they sold the corpses to researchers. And Mary Shelley is aware of this. Actually, her own husband, Percy Shelley, had conducted some experiments with galvanism, meaning with electricity, and trying to move muscles with electricity. And that can be done. With a frog, you put some kind of electric impulse in its legs, and the legs of the frog move, even if the frog is dead, right? Something similar happened with human corpses. So they were wondering if with electricity, if we can get some muscles to move, can that be done in a sustainable way, in such a way that this corpse will regain life? So remember that scientific revolution had started at least 2 centuries before Mary Shelley wrote this work. 1610, for example, is when Galilei published Sidereus Nuncius, and Roger Bacon published his Novum Organon, and that had triggered the scientific revolution. So the research about scientific revolution had already been going on for 2 centuries, and it was not clear where this scientific revolution was leading humanity to. That is why many have seen this novel as a reflection of what scientific experimentation can do. And if there are or there should be ethical boundaries in scientific experimentation. Remember that Dr. Victor Frankenstein, in his quest, in his research, he's hampered by scientific protocols, so he decides to do away with scientific protocols. Victor Frankenstein breaks scientific protocols. He writes, I think it's page 54 of the critical edition, as the minuteness of the parts formed a great hindrance to my speed, I resolved, contrary to my first attention, to make the being of gigantic stature. So at first he wanted to make it a human size. Then he ends up making an 8-foot creature because the minuteness was too difficult to work with. So he starts making a great monster with big parts because that's a lot more manageable for him. Coincidentally, and I say coincidentally without irony because I think it was just a mere coincidence, but that same year, Hegel, you know Hegel, you've heard of him, right? The great philosopher. 1818, in his speech to inaugurate the academic year, I don't have the exact quote here, but he says something along these lines. There's no mystery science cannot unveil. Our scientific research will be able to get to know every mystery, every abyss, both underneath the earth and up in the stars. There's nothing our human intellect cannot attain. There's no knowledge our human intellect cannot attain. Maybe it might sound too optimistic for our mindset, but notice how he is very optimistic about human knowledge and scientific research, and philosophy will take human knowledge practically to the infinite and beyond. There's no limit to what our human minds can get to know. This quest of knowledge should also remind us of Dr. Faust. And to read literature, you have to be very responsible. Because is Dr. Faust a warning or is it a motivation? Is it preventing you from overstepping your boundaries, or is it moving you to transgress those boundaries? It's a reflection about the seductive power of scientific experimentation. Roger Bacon had said, knowledge is power. And when do we get enough power? Never. We can never be satiated like Dr. Faust. That is why Victor Frankenstein is never content with what he has achieved. Of course, this is also an anticipation. I don't think this crossed Mary Shelley's mind, but it speaks to us very eloquently about what's going on in our days with human cloning. This is the creation of science fiction. This is an unprecedented work of literature that bequeaths to posterity the concept of science fiction. Because it's fictional, of course it's fictional, but there's some scientific grounding, which would evolve even to Jurassic Park. And when you think of Jurassic Park, by the way, especially in Jurassic Park 1, the dialogues are quite philosophical. God creates dinosaur, God destroys dinosaur, God creates man, man creates dinosaur, dinosaur destroys man. And what's the end of the line? And women inherit the land. So there's a lot of philosophy in Jurassic Park. Well, not a lot, but there's some philosophy in Jurassic Park. And you can see that without Mary Shelley, science fiction wouldn't have come to its existence as we know it. Of course, it has its scientific approach. Additionally, it can also be seen as a reflection on politics. Mary Shelley had seen the horrors of war. And even if it's not a direct consequence of the French Revolution, it comes after the French Revolution. And the French Revolution was idealistic, it was optimistic. They thought that doing away with kings and letting our political system be guided by reason, there would be prosperity. And what did we end up with? With horrors. It can also be seen as a reflection on slavery. But let's focus now on the French Revolution. Could the monster be a metaphor of the French Revolution? We created this hoping it would be something brilliant, something wonderful, something that brings lots of benefits to mankind. And now we find that that which we created is something we cannot handle. It's something that overpowers us, and it's something that becomes destructive. There's a lot more to say about politics, and I don't think the political metaphor was absent from Mary Shelley's mind, especially given the fact that both her father and her mother were philosophers, especially delving into social and political philosophy. It can also be seen as a reflection on the human person. Mary Shelley is a teenager who, I think like most teenagers, is going through a struggle to understand herself. Let's look at the evolution of the monster. Let's look at the evolution of the creature. First, the monster becomes aware. He gains consciousness. He's exposed to a wide range of sensorial experiences, and he becomes aware of the world around him. Then, he masters language. Then, he's looking for a sense of self. He's looking for his own identity, and he's trying to come to terms with his own identity. To gain that sense of self, he also has to have some sense of belonging. Where do I belong to? That is why he looks for affection. And in his quest for affection, he experiences pain. He experiences rejection. He experiences incomprehension. So that could be a metaphor of the human person trying to understand him or herself. Wide metaphor or an extended metaphor of the work can also be seen as the danger of obsession. The dangers of obsession. The dangers of obsession. Eventually, Herman Melville would expand on this in his novel Moby Dick. But let us focus now on this incipient version of a caveat, a cautionary tale about the dangers of obsession. Victor Frankenstein becomes obsessed with his idea. He becomes obsessed with his experimentation, and this brings ruin to him. And any obsession is destructive. Be it a business, be it an enterprise, be it an endeavor, be it science, be it one's own study. Every obsession is very detrimental. It can also be seen as a quest for a partner and the experience of loneliness. Victor had his friend, Henry Clerval, and he was betrothed to Elizabeth. It's not like he was alone, but in his quest for that adequate other, he creates an inadequate other that destroys what was dear to him. Finally, and maybe this is the most important of all interpretations, could it be seen or could it be read as an autobiography? How much of herself did Mary Shelley put into the novel? You know that this novel is written like 3 concentric parentheses, right? We have Walton writing letters, who recounts the tale of Victor, who in his turn recounts the tale of the monster. Let's expand this a little. Let's create 5 parentheses. We have Mary Shelley, who's writing the novel. She writes the novel about Walton, who's writing letters to her sister. Walton tells the story of Victor Frankenstein, the doctor. The doctor tells the story of the monster. And what story does the monster tell? The story of the cottagers. We find at least 5 parentheses. All of them concentric. And they all have one particular trait, the absence of the mother. Mary Shelley had no mother. Walton and Margaret relate as brother and sister, but there's no mention of the mother. Victor relates to his father, but again, we assume that his father is a widower who has, so Victor has no mother. Of course, the monster had a father, had a conflict with his father, but there was no mother. And in the story of the cottagers, there was the father, there were the brother and sister, but there was no mother. Mary Shelley was speaking about her own experience with the absence of a mother and with an overbearing presence of her father. Remember the conflict Mary Shelley had sustained with her own father? This is something that the creature also brings up and represents that conflict of the creature with his creator. Let me just finish with this quote. The monster asks, "But where are my friends and relations? No father had watched my infant days. No mother had blessed me with her smiles and caresses. Or if they had, all my past life was now a vault, a blind vacancy in which I distinguished nothing. From my earliest remembrances, I had been as I then was in height and proportion. I had never yet seen a being resembling me or who claimed any intercourse with me. What was I? The question again recurred, to be answered only with groans." So I hope this was insightful and helpful for us to delve into the various interpretations and various angles this work can be approached from. There are many more, but I hope this was helpful for you. Thank you.